As you may or may not know, I've been sharing on Instagram the amount of books that I've been reading, and it's a little bit too much. I usually do a recap every year with the books that I've read, but this time I overdid it. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna divide this video in two videos. So I'm gonna talk first about fiction, which includes poetry and novels, and then I'm gonna make a separate video about nonfiction, which is gonna be like political theory, philosophy, and so on and so forth. So yeah, this is the first video, the first installment of the books that I read that are fiction based. So let's go. All right, this is the narrative pile. I read how many? 6 books of narratives, which is pretty good, I would say. I'm not a narrative person. I don't usually read novels. I'm gonna start with I'm gonna start here. I read this one. I read The Yellow Paper by Charlotte Perkins. It's very short. It's actually like a very short story. It's like 15 pages long. Somebody recommended it on TikTok, and I was like, oh, that sounds fun. I'm gonna read it, and it's okay. It's very short. If you can find it online, it's better than just purchasing a copy. I bought this on Amazon, and it's so short that actually the last, I don't know, 4 pages are completely blank because it says notes in case you want to take notes on the amazing adventure you just went through. It's okay, nothing mind-boggling, but the interesting thing is that it's written by a woman at a time in which women had very little agency. It's from 1892. So, I mean, fiction written by a woman in 1892, that's interesting in itself. It's like a horror story that deals more than anything with the anxiety that women were experiencing when going through a marriage, and these people moving to a new house, and she's staring at the wallpaper and she's getting mad about it. She's driving herself insane, or it's okay. I don't remember much. I read it at the beginning of the year and it was like a meh feeling, so it's on the meh pile, I would say. The meh pile. Alright, I read from Nella Larsen this book called Quicksand. I mean, it's this particular copy that I have, it has 3 things. It has the novel Passing, the novel Quicksand, and some short stories. I only read Quicksand because that was the one that I was assigned to read. I took a class on modernism in Colombia, and one of the assigned books was this, so I read it. I mean, the Quicksand was the one that was assigned. It's okay. It's a story about a mulatto woman. Her mother's white, her father's black, and her mother took care of her, and she's been enduring the racism of, the United States, New York in particular. She's living in Harlem, and she's dealing with her blackness in a time when it's very difficult to navigate. It's 1928, so imagine a woman and a black woman making sense of her duties in life and whatnot. And she's a very strong, independent woman, and she's making a case for herself, and she doesn't want to be, constrained by other men and just do her things like like the ultimate girl boss story. But at the same time, at some moment, the character just flips. Here's the thing. There's a tradition of the mulatto story, of the woman who goes back to her place of birth, and then she finds her identity, and then she gets rejected for her identity, which happened to Nella too. She was the only black woman in the family because all her other relatives are white, and when she needed help or financial stability and she needed like some help from any relatives, it was denied to her. So she wrote this story based on that experience, the act of, what if there was somebody out there who could pick me up and help me navigate this thing? I would say more than anything it's interesting because of the context, the historical context and the main character. But as a story, it's okay. The pacing is fine. One thing that I thought was really cool was the way in which the narrator sometimes is describing something, and you can tell the main character is always angry. It has like an anger underneath her. She says things, but underneath she's like, what are you saying? And the way in which the book is narrated, she's describing things, and then the narrator herself gets angry, and it starts narrating from an angry perspective, and it's so cool. I think that shift in narrator is really interesting, so just for that reason, it might be worth checking out. Also written by a woman, Willa Carter, wrote The Professor's House. It's a story about growing old and finding your own identity, and about the legacy that we leave behind after so much effort. It's nice. It's at some point the novel is going through and advancing, and book, there's another book inside the book. and then there's another book inside the book, or more than anything, there's a story going on, and then you have a segment in which they explain to you one of the characters that everybody's talking about, and then the novel keeps going, and that segment illuminates so much of the story. It's okay. It didn't blow me away. The narrative is fine. The pace is fine. It's just hard for me to get invested in characters. Like, that's why I don't read many novels or like fiction in general in terms of stories, because it's hard for me to like feel invested in the characters and follow them on an adventure. And like, that's why I don't watch movies. It's hard for me to get invested in characters. So this book requires you to get invested in characters. If you're a reader who enjoys, liking characters and finding their psychology and discovering what they're thinking and whatnot, this might be good. So it follows the story of Professor St. Peter when he's not about to retire, but he's growing old, and his two daughters have left the house, and he's now in this huge house, so he moves to another house, but he still keeps his studio in the old house that he's renting. So he has this tension between wanting to have this new life, but also like wanting to stay in the studio that he was working in, and all the memories, and his daughters go and visit him and they talk about their life, and it's this constant moving back and forth between memories and negotiating their memories with his daughters and trying to understand his own role in the family and his daughter's role in his life. It's a coming of age story, but like a growing old coming of age story. It's nice. It's okay. I just find it lacks some kind of political depth to it. It has some. One of the core elements of the story is like this ethic stance, like, oh, you do things because it's the right thing to do, and the main character is very ethical. But it's very apolitical, and at times it feels like it's needed. The book talks a lot about identity, and there's a Jewish character. This is like in the 1925, so the Jewish character is also a rich guy, but it's also like you can tell there's some anti-Semitism going on. There's also a lot of reflection about the role of Native Americans and their crafts and why they're not contemplated to go into museums, how they're rendered invisible by the mainstream, academia or mode of thinking. It's okay. It's not mind-blowing, but if those topics like speak to you, that's fine. I just felt it was quite bland politically. So, and it's no wonder, like Villa Carter is not a leftist. She has all the elements of a leftist discourse, but she's not tying it to a leftist discourse. So you're left with kind of like old school identity politics in a way. So, I don't know. There's a classic, probably most of you have read it. I had never read this one, The Great Gatsby. Man, that was great. That was a great way of like introducing myself to Fitzgerald. I have never read Fitzgerald, and this was my first time. I mean, it's a classic. You know what it's about. I don't need to summarize much for you. There's this guy who lives in a house, and there's this mysterious figure, some kind of Mr. Gatsby, who lives nearby. And then it's this little short adventure of this guy meeting Gatsby, and Gatsby falling in love and trying to court a woman, and what happens there. More than anything, it's not the story is not what's key. What's key is the way in which it's written, which is a very modernist thing. It was very hard for me at the beginning because I don't, as you know, I don't read much fiction, and the pacing was really fast at times and really slow at others. And the interesting thing is finding out why it gets slow or why it moves fast. There's a moment in which a guy smacks a woman in the face, and it's described in between other things. Like the novel is talking about something, and then this guy smacks this woman in the face, and then keeps narrating, and it seems so unimportant. And it's heart-wrenching. Like, oh my God, what happened here? But just, it's like nobody cares. It's such a nice, crude and direct summary of what was like in 1925 America. It's very like Art Nouveau kind of vibe. Everything is all the things. It's full of things. Like the house has some nice tapestries or like nice curtains, and there's some nice shirts, and the characters describe the beautiful, gowns and adorns and the cars, and everything is like flashy and expensive and whatnot. And at the same time, there's a clear feeling that humanity There's a clear critique of what America was becoming, or the spirit that was driving it, which is a spirit of like a performative spirit. The idea that money and flashy clothes and just, you know, pretending to be someone was more important than being someone. There's an emphasis on performative, there's an emphasis on pretending to have an identity instead of being yourself. Be who you want to be, you know, perform. That's the spirit of Big Gatsby, the Great Gatsby. Which Gatsby, it's not that great, and that's the funny thing about it. It's just this guy. Really nice. Recommend it. If you haven't read it, you should. Talking about a way in which things are written. I read Ernest Hemingway, The Sun Also Rises. I was always afraid of Hemingway, but I decided to go for this one, The Sun Also Rises. And man, it's just amazing. It's so well written. It's crazy. The book basically follows a character and his adventures when going to Spain with some friends, and they go on a lake and they fish and they drink, and it's very based on the notion of these people are desperately trying to be perceived as cool. That's what they most want in the world. And there's this other guy who follows them around, this, you know, Jewish guy who falls in love with one of the girls in the group. And they make fun of him for being Jewish. There's also the topic of anti-Semitism has come up quite a bit. But also, like, they're just mean people. And they have these adventures, and it's narrated in a first person, but it feels like nobody cares about what's happening, and that's what's cool about it. They're being cool by not caring. In a way, they're also following the topic of Gatsby. They're just characters who perform a character. They're just, oh, I don't care, I'm just too cool to care. There's a character in one moment in which, like, he has a lot of money, or he comes from a tradition of money, and they meet up, and the guy just orders a very expensive bottle for drink, and they will look at each other like, oh, that's ew, that's like that's not cool. You don't order the most expensive, you know, drink, because that's not cool. You need to drink something that's like below, so we can say, oh, we don't care. So everything is very dry, everything is very like in this unaffected way. I have to read you one moment. There's a moment in which they're spoilers, I don't know. There's a moment in which they go to Spain and they see they're looking at bullfight, and Pedro Romero falls in love with this girl Brett, and they describe like the aftermath of what happened. Vicente Gironès is a bullfighter and he gets killed. So I'm just gonna read you like this much, just one paragraph. Look at how it's written. The bull who killed Vicente Gironès was named Bocanegra, was number 118 of the bull breeding establishment of Sanchez Taberno, and was killed by Pedro Romero as the third bull of that same afternoon. His ear was cut by popular acclamation and given to Pedro Romero, who, in turn, gave it to Brett, who wrapped it in a handkerchief belonging to myself, and left both the ear and the handkerchief, along with a number of Murati cigarette stubs, shoved far back in the drawer of the bed table that stood beside her bed in the Hotel of Montoya in Pamplona. It's so beautifully written. It just passes through and it tells you all you need to know. This guy is in love with this girl. He cuts the ear from the bull. You can imagine the whole stadium roaring. And the guy, she asked for a handkerchief, and the main character gives her a handkerchief. The guy puts the bull ear there. She covers the bull ear, takes it to the hotel. She smokes at night, turned like, puts off the cigarettes in the bedside table and shoves the ear there and shoves the cigarettes and just doesn't care. And that's the end of it. Like, that's just a life that was taken for nothing. That's the vibe of the whole book. Everything feels like meh, I don't care, meh, I don't care. And it's such a lonely way of expressing care, because there is no care for anybody. There's just individualism at its finest. Really cool, really interesting. All the characters are trying to be this macho guy and be like, oh yeah, I'm so tough. And it's silly, it's almost childish, but it's endearing in its childishness. And if you read the book from a distance, it's an amazing read. Highly recommend it. If you haven't read it, go for it. It's not long. It's like, 200 something? 250 pages with a big type. It's really fast to read. Like I recommended this to Fran, and she read it in like a week too. Like we both just swallowed this book. It's really good. Go for it. We have reached the point where I need to talk about the two books that really impacted me this year. I'm gonna go first for this one because it's longer, and as you can tell, there's a lot that I liked. This is The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky, and this was the big challenge that I had for this year. I started reading this because Fran wanted to read it and I wanted to read it. So she said, I'm going to read it. You want to read it along? And I was like, okay, I'm going to read it too. And then we can comment on it. And as I was reading through it, I started marking some moments because it's just so beautiful. It's hard for me to explain to you how beautiful it is. But the best way I can describe it is Dostoevsky feels like a very reliable narrator in the sense that it's very fair in his assessments. You just go for this ride in which there's this guy, Fyodor Karamazov, who has a bunch of, children, has some kids. And it's these brothers who come from this father who has money, but he spends all his money. It's a clear critique of the way in which the rich people in Russia at the time were just wasting money, because that was the way of showing money. Dostoevsky lived in the 1800s, so it's about the movement that the rich people were doing and how disconnected they were from reality. Serfdom was on its way out, so you didn't have like proper slaves, but it was like a very intense way of having servitude. There's a lot of beating when people get angry with each other. Just beat each other's ass, and it's terrifying. There's a lot of violence. If you've ever read a Russian novel, or if you ever read like a Russian play, you know what I'm talking about. Russian plays and novels feel like there's some kind of unsettling violence underneath it all, and this is no exception. But this is just so beautiful. This the three brothers, Dmitry, Alyosha, Smerdakov. Is there another one? I don't remember the other one. Ivan and Fyodor. These are the main characters, and there's some such amazing characters. This Grushenka, who's like this woman that everybody desires. And there's moments of deep humanity all throughout the novel. And when I say deep humanity, is that characters do sometimes behave in ways that you're like, what? Why are they doing this? But then you think about it and you put yourself in the position of the character and you're like, yeah, that's something I will probably do. Yeah, like sometimes they get offered money, for example, and they say no, and they reject it like angrily and do like they make a tantrum about it. And you're like, why are they doing this? And you're like, oh, yeah, I can see why. Or they lie. They lie sometimes. And you're like, why are they lying? Oh, I can see that. And the narrator is always fair. Like it never gangs up against the character. It always talks about how everything is very normal. And the most interesting thing is that, contrary to the other novels that I've been recommending, the voice of the narrator is almost invisible. It doesn't really matter. It's just telling you a story. It's like a random guy telling you a story in a simple way. Let me see if I can find something to show you how well written it is. Gregory knew that he had a strong influence over his master. It was true, and he was aware of it. Karamazov was an obstinate and cunning buffoon, and yet, though his will was strong enough in some affairs of life, as he expressed it, he found himself, to his surprise, extremely feeble in facing certain other emergencies. He knew his weaknesses and was afraid of them. There are positions in which one has to keep a sharp lookout, and that's not easy without a trustworthy man. And Gregory was a most trustworthy man. It's such a simple observation. It's such a simple observation. There are positions in which one has to keep a sharp lookout, and that's not easy without a trustworthy man, like somebody by your side. I know it doesn't sound like much, but this kind of little observations about life, they're sprinkled throughout the novel, and there are some moments of deep humanity. I cried through the book. I laughed through the book. It's an adventure. Like you're gonna just have a ride with these characters. It's a beautiful novel. I know 900 pages sounds long, and if you read like, oh, Dostoevsky, Karamazov Brothers, oh, that sounds difficult. It's not. It's really not difficult. Like I never read novels. Like this year, I basically started reading novels. Like last year, really, and it was really easy to follow, and it was engaging. It was simple. At the beginning, I was not sure, like, oh, will I like this or not? But as you go along and you start building a relationship with these characters and how they behave and what they do, why they reason the way they do, you fall in love with the way in which the book is narrated. It's so humane and it's so simple and it tells you things and it says, okay, I can't go into much detail here because I'm losing my track, so we're gonna move to this side. And you're like, okay, that sounds fair. I always had the feeling that the narrator was like, on my side and was telling me a story. So it's just amazing. This is just a gem to read. And by the same token, the other book that I just absolutely freaking adored was this, As I Lay Dying by Faulkner. This has been like a revelation to me. This book was amazing. It's nothing short of impressive. It's just beautiful throughout. It's not an easy book. It's not long. How long is it? It's not long at all. It's like like 260 pages. So it's not long, as you can tell. I read it in like, I don't know, 2 weeks or so, a week and a half. And I was taking my time. So if you really get into it, you'll read it much faster. But here's the kicker, and here's the tricky thing. You at least I'm gonna write you through my experience. I started reading this book and I had no idea what it was about. I had no idea what I was reading. I was just reading pages and pages and I was like, I don't know who these characters are. I don't know who's who. I don't know what they're doing. I don't know why any of this matters. And then about halfway through the book, you get to a point where you understand what's happening. And it's like to me, it was like a cold shiver. Like, oh my God, is this what the book is about? And then you keep going and now you understand what's happening. It's amazing. It's just amazing for two reasons. One, it's a series of monologues, which is nice because I wrote a novel long ago, Las Neuronas Espejo, in which I made basically a similar operation. Like all the characters talk in the same voice, and they all describe things. In my novel, part of the fun was discovering whose character is talking. Right, so I'll just make a monologue, and by the content of the monologue, you have to decipher, oh, who's talking, why is this important? In this novel, it's not like that. Like, you get the names, Cash, Darrell, and so on. You get who's talking, but you don't know who these people are. You don't know what they're doing. It's very disconcerting, but at the same time, the way in which it is written, it's so beautiful. It's like it's like the author is just a wizard with words. Like, it's just amazing. I have to read you. I'm gonna read you just 2 pages. This is page like 14, so don't worry, you're not missing anything. By the way, when you get to this point, you don't know what's happening. So I'm gonna read you with some emphasis because I know what's happening. But if you're confused, don't worry. That's the game of the novel. You have no idea what's happening. Jewel. It's because he stays out there, right under the window, hammering and sewing that goddamn box where she's got to see him, where every breath she draws is full of his knocking and sewing, where she can see him saying, see what a good one I'm making for you? I told him to go somewhere else. I said, good God, do you want her to see it? It's like when he was a little boy and she says if she had some fertilizer, she would try to raise some flowers, and he'd taken the bread pan and brought it back from the barn full of dung, and now them others sitting there like buzzards waiting, fanning themselves, because I said, if you wouldn't keep on sewing and nailing it until a man can sleep over, and her hands laying on a quilt like 2 of them roots dug up and tried to wash and you couldn't get them clean. I can see the fan, Dewey Dell's arm. I said, if you just let her alone, sawing and knocking and keeping the air always moving so fast on her face, and then when you're tired you can't breathe, and that goddamn eight's going one lick less, one lick less, one lick less, until everybody that passes on the road will have to stop and see it and say what a fine carpenter he is. If it had just been me when Cash fell off that church, and if it had just been me when Pat laid sick on that load of wood and fell off him, if it would not be happening with every bastard in the country coming in to stare at her, because if there is a God, then what the hell is he for? It would just be me and her on a high heel, and me rolling on the rocks on the hill at their faces and picking them up and throwing them down the hill, faces and teeth, and all by God, until she was quiet and not have that goddamn AIDS going one lick less, and we could be quiet. What the hell, man? It's just that. It's monologues all throughout. You have no clue what's happening. Read it. Read it completely blind. I went in completely blind. Just don't read the book. Don't read anything. Just go into it. Buy the book. Read it. Get confused. Get angry. Get pissed at me. Like, why is Eduardo recommending this? It's so stupid. I hate it. And then halfway through the novel, you're going to be like, oh. I'm waiting for you to get that moment. It's a treasure. That moment is a treasure. Please do so. Best book, by far. Poetry. This is Maps, collected and last poems by Wisława Szymborska. Beautiful collection of poems. I liked it. I marked a few of them. There's some nice moments. One thing that got my attention was that many of these poems they had really, really interesting and powerful openings, but not all of them like close the way I would like. But it's fine. It's fine. It's just a nice collection of poems. Over wine. He glanced, gave me extra charm, and I took it as my own. Happily, I gulped a star. I let myself be invented, modeled on my own reflection in his eyes. I dance in the stir of sudden wings. The chair's a chair, the wine is a wine, in a wine glass, that's the wine glass standing there by standing there. I'm imaginary. Make-believe beyond belief, so fictitious that it hurts. And I tell him tales about ants that die of love beneath the dandelion's constellation. I swear a white rose will sing if you sprinkle it with wine. I laugh and tilt my head cautiously, as if to check whether the invention works. I dance inside my stunned skin, his arms that create me. Eve from the rift, Venus from the foam, Minerva from Jupiter's head, all the three were more real than me. When he isn't looking at me, I try to catch my reflection on the wall and see the nail where the picture used to be. It's so simple, but it's so sensual. I like it. It's not my favorite, but it was a good read. I read this one by Maggie Nelson, Bluets, and it didn't do much for me, unfortunately. I wanted to like it. I did my best, but it just didn't happen. Nothing personal with Maggie. I don't know her. Maybe she's amazing, but it just the book didn't do much for me. It's a collection of observations regarding the color blue, and it's like almost 200 something. Yeah, 240 observations regarding the color blue. There's some nice moments, some cool observations, but in general, I felt kind of underwhelmed. I thought, I don't know, I'm gonna read you like 88. Like many self-help books, The Deepest Blue is full of horrifyingly simplistic language and some admittedly good advice. Somehow the woman in the book all learned to say, "That's my depression talking. It's not me." Good. 75. Mostly I've felt myself becoming a servant of sadness. I am still looking for the beauty in that. 121. Clearness is so eminently one of the characteristics of truth that often it passes for truth itself, wrote Joseph Gourget, the French man of letters who recorded countless of such fragments in notebooks for 40 years in preparation for a monumental work of philosophy that he never wrote. I know all about this passing for truth. At times I think it's quite possible that it lies, as if a sleight of hand, at the heart of all my writing. It's fine, it just doesn't do it for me. I feel like nice observations, interesting, but I feel like it's mixed with like sex and desire and a lot of sensuality that it feels doesn't it's a sensuality and a sexuality that just doesn't appeal to me at all. That's the issue I have with it. I feel too much distance between what I like and the book, so I couldn't thoroughly enjoy it, but it's fine. By Clara Mucchetti, La Vida Normal. Clara Mucchetti makes 105 fragments of observation of everyday life. And yeah, she's a Chilean poet. And it's nice, but it's very similar to Happen to Me with Bluets. It's just, sure, like nice observations, but I wasn't able to fully enter into the world proposed by the author. She talks about sickness and reflections of the self, and how do you see yourself in everyday life, where fragments of you exist. But it was underwhelming. It just didn't do it for me. All good, no hate. Maybe Clara has other books that are amazing, but this one didn't do it for me. Among books that didn't do it for me, man, I read a lot of poetry I didn't like. I read all of Roberto Bolaño's poetry, this reunited poetry, and I've come to a conclusion that I don't like Roberto Bolaño's poetry. I think he's a great novelist. 2666 is one of my favorites. Amazing novel. That was my highly recommended book of last year. So I decided, I'm going to read Bolaño's poetry. And I marked some. It just didn't do it for me. I'm sorry. I don't even want to read the poems that I highlighted because I can't recommend this book, and I can't recommend Bolaño in general as a writer for poetry. As a novelist, I highly recommend Savage Detectives, and I highly, highly, highly recommend 2666. Amazing journey, beautiful book, but this one just didn't cut at all. It's just, no. A hard pass for me. Same. Hard pass for me, this one. Nicanor Parra, Poemas para Combatir la Calvicie. If you don't know, Nicanor Parra is one of Chile's, he was one of the greatest poets in Chile. Your mileage may vary, you may not think so. He was very famous for writing anti-poetry. Okay. And writing this little, making these little things that he called artifacts, in which he will write poems in things, or make like little cartoons. And those were, like, make these little cartoons in like paper plates and whatnot, and those were poetic artifacts. It's okay, as you can tell, I highlighted nothing. I got nothing out of this book. I'm so sorry. Some people really love Nicanor Parra, and they think he's great. I just don't like it at all. I couldn't get to it. I read all of it and just did nothing. Similar to Bolaño, similar to what happened with Blue, it's just sex is present in a way that it's not enjoyable for me to read. There's a lot of objectivization of women here, and in Bolaño too. A lot of talking about women's bodies and like sex, and there's a lot of like cunning old men in these things, like, you gotta find yourself a newer one, a younger one, something not so old, and it feels like very boomer. It's very like macho wannabe intellectual commenting on women's kind of vibe, and I just don't like it. If it's your liking, that's great. Some people really like Parra. It did nothing for me. I didn't like it. Wouldn't recommend. Please don't go for it. I read Look by Solmaz Sharif. I wanted to read this because it talks about war and death, and it's on moments it's very heart-wrenching and intense, and it feels deeply sad. But at the same time, I was left with a feeling of it didn't impact me much. It had like a few moments in which I was like, that's beautiful, that's really insightful, or that's beautifully written, or that's beautifully put together, or that's such a complex emotion that's been drawn. But in general, it's more like a compilation of events and things that have happened. It's nice. Like, he won the American Book Award the Penn Center USA Library Award of Poetry and the Holmes National Poetry Prize. So like it's not a bad book at all, but it didn't do much for me either. Like it was very hard for me to get into the style of writing. I felt it very distant, and when I was able to connect, it didn't give me what I was wanting. It was okay, but it wasn't like my favorite at all. Um, Man, another book that I wanted to read and I didn't like. I had a bad poetry year, guys. I read The Lights by Ben Lerner. I love Ben Lerner. As you know, 10:04 is one of my all-time favorite novels. Angle of Jaw, his collection of poetry, one of his first books, is still one of my favorite poetry books. Ben Lerner is probably, along with Jack Spicer and Anne Carson, some of my favorite poets. But this book just didn't do it for me at all. It feels like a very smart writer is taking notes on the Notes app and then just making a book out of it. That's how it feels. That's probably what it is. I have no idea. But that's the feeling I get. It's like notes. Just notes that the author has. And sometimes he makes nice points or whatever, but I mark 2 moments in the book, and it's not easy to mark just 2 points. One of the issues I have is that he makes these long descriptions, like poems that seem like narrative, and there's one that's very nice called The Voice, but the others just didn't do it for me. And there's another moment in a poem called, or a text called The Theory, in which he also makes like a nice moment, but yeah, but in general, like for example, this is the pace of the book. As I spoke, I became aware of the blue scarf around my neck. He studied weak interactions. He asked prize-winning questions about dark matter. He really loved your sister and bought 2 of her paintings before she blew up. Actually, he had that great portrait of you where the palm-like shapes on your shirt begin to vibrate and float away. The grains of wool, the scalloped forms of leaves or waves, the design on carpets, the exact repetition of the bricks on the wall I ask you to imagine, the nectar guides in orchids, Emma's surface detached but not simply flatten or become quilt-like. The freed patterns remain in what feels like a habitable space. I remember when she painted that, I said. I don't know why I had to sit there all day while she was painting. Don't really look like what was in front of her. It was the summer, so she was home from college, and I was supposed to be doing this online high school equivalent thing. The only way that you'd... You know what I mean? You know what I mean? It's nice observations, it's got nice passages, moments in which he picks like, oh, like this little moment that I just read, like, oh, he bought this paintings. Oh, remember that painting? Oh, that painting that she painted, and one that I am in. Oh, and there was a wall, and I was wondering, why is she painting me? Why is she making me sit still so long while she's not painting me? And that little observation, it's a nice observation. It's a nice moment. It's buried in the description, or it's basically the description. The book has those moments, but it's hard to connect with them. Like I was left wondering, what about it? That was my question all the time. I was reading these reflections and I was like, sure, but what about it? And then this, and this, and this, and this, and you're like, sure, but what about it? What about it is important? What about it needed to be turned into a book? What about it, man? I didn't like it. I finished it. It was a pain to finish. It took me like 2 months or something. It should take like if you become engaged with this book, it's like 100 pages. You can read it in a few days, 2-3 days, easy. It's poetry. It took me almost 2 months to finish. It was just left unfinished, and I took it with me, and I would be reading other books while I was reading this, and I dreaded so long. I didn't like it. I love Ben Lerner, but this book didn't do it for me. Now, 2 books that did it for me. 1, T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland. Also, American modernism. But why not, you know? It's great. Similar to what happens with As I Lay Dying, you're gonna start reading T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, and probably you're not gonna understand anything. And that's by design. T.S. Eliot wants the audience to do not derive meaning from the words, but getting to the feeling and the images. So this book was written while he was recovering in a Swiss sanitarium from a mental collapse in 1921. And he created this book, and it feels, to me, this book. By the way, when he finished this poem, "The Wasteland," T.S. Eliot was famous. He will go to give lectures, and he could fill stadiums. Can you imagine nowadays a poet filling a stadium of people wanting to go to a talk about poetry? That's crazy. He's a superstar. He became a superstar. T.S. Eliot has problematic views, very problematic, but you can understand the contribution that he was doing to poetry through his work. The core thing that I would say, to me, was it really helped me to understand this book as an exercise on sampling. He will take bits and pieces of other works of literature and put them in the book, and then just connect them wildly, and that will in itself be a poem. And that was amazing. It has moments in itself. I'm going to read you an excerpt. Stanza 75 until 85, so 10 lines, very short. And the afternoon, the evening sleeps so peacefully, smoothed by long fingers, asleep, tired, or it malingers, stretched on the floor here beside you and me. Should I, after tea and cakes and ices, have the strength to force the moment of this crisis? But though I have wept and fasted, wept and prayed, though I have seen my head grown slightly bald, brought upon in a platter, I am no prophet, and here's no great matter. I have seen the moment of my greatness flicker, and I have seen the eternal footman hold my coat and snicker, and in short, I was afraid. It's beautiful. To me, that's beautiful. It's little passages like that make it interesting. And at least my copy, probably yours too if you buy it, at the end of it, it has a lot of annotations telling you what the hell all the little moments in the book were. It's cool. It's really nice, The Wasteland. It's a beautiful little book. It's a nice journey. You're going to get into unknown territory. You're going to get lost. And whatever you find when you get lost, that's what you're supposed to find. It's not about finding one unequivocal meaning. It's not about making anything clear. Like every other modernist, it's a fight against clarity, against clear meaning, against like a stable and unifying message. And it's more the experience. Very good, very nice. The last one. And I'm sorry for leaving this at last, but here it is. I bought Objetivo General by Yanko Gonzalez. Yanko Gonzalez is a Chilean poet. I really like the poetry from Yanko Gonzalez. I'm translating one book of Yanko Gonzalez. I have been for a few years, but now I'm going to have some time to actually go for it. But it has such nice moments. This book is beautiful. It's a collection of other books that Yanko Gonzalez has written. So it's basically a collection of a bunch of his poetry from other text. I'm wondering, yeah, there you go. So it's a collection of El Ábuga, the Alto Volta, Metales Pesados, and Torpedos. Those are and a little coda. Those are the books that are compiled in here. And he just goes gracefully through all of them. Yanko Gonzalez, great poet. It's in Spanish, but man, it's so beautiful. I'm just going to read one in Spanish. For those of you who don't speak Spanish, I'm sorry, I don't feel like translating it, but those of you who do, I'm gonna know how good he is. 1999-2011. Querido Leopold, lee esto muy despacio y créeme que no tengo otra forma de decirlo. Si hasta aquí has leído deprisa, te pido vuelvas a comenzar de nuevo. No me atrevo a pulsar tu número y quemar el poco aliento que nos queda. No seré quien arriba, no seré quien parte para quedar en la mitad y vacía. No te apresures. No te fíes de mi brevedad, porque este día pardo terminará en el mismo día pardo que persistirá inmutable en otro día pardo. Querido mío, hoy a las 4:30 de la madrugada nuestro hijo nos dejó. Sus ojos ya no muestran ni sienten dolor. Perdóname, he perdido un cuerpo para llegar y he perdido un cuerpo para regresar. Holy fuck, man. It's so beautiful. Like this, Yanko Gonzalez has this way of describing little life with details and give you like a punch sometimes in the end, or like in the middle of the poem there's like a twist, and it's like an emotional twist. It's so beautiful. this was great. This was really great. So in summary, let me make a little bit of a summary here. Top 5 books of this year, kind of in order, will be T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland. Highly recommended. Beautiful. Already said everything I had to say. Yanko Gonzalez, Objetivo General. Amazing poetry. Highly recommended. The Sun Also Rises. What a novel, man. What a beautiful and heart-wrenching travel journey. And then these two, they're exactly at the same level to me. The experience of reading these two was just phenomenally beautiful. The brothers Karamazov and As I Lay Dying, these are just top tier. If you can read novels next year, just pick these two, man. These are just all of the 5 books that I recommend that are amazing. If the 5 can go into your reading list, you're gonna thank me for it because they're just extremely good. But these two are just beautiful. There's nothing like these two at all. It's just anomalies. They're anomaly good. So yeah, that's it. I hope you enjoy my little description of the books that I read regarding fiction. I'll see you in the next episode, so we're gonna talk about non-fiction. Because I read a lot of non-fiction. Actually, I read more non-fiction than fiction. Anyway, I'll see you super soon. Thanks for sticking around. And yeah, until the next one. Bye bye.